Welcome to the history of freedom. With all that we see going on in the world right now, it's so very important to understand where our freedoms and where our tolerant and free society came from. What are the roots of our tolerant and free society? So that's what we're going to look into. We're going to discover, and I think any secular historian who's honest would have to agree, that when you trace the values that we have in Western civilization, you're tracing the concepts that are in the Bible. And if they don't get that, or if that is somehow missed their notice, it's really pretty poor and not very competent as historians, because the historian Thomas Cahill, who's one of my favorites, really traces the essence of who we are, even back to Abraham. And just as a secular historian, he explains how what Abraham did and how Abraham thought totally revolutionized the way that people think, the way they relate to each other, the way they relate to God, but the way they treat concepts like progress, for instance. So these things are tied directly with the concepts in the Bible. So he has this book called The Gifts of the Jews, which you also might very much enjoy. This treatise should be also simple enough for a child to go through. So I'm going to work very hard to put things on the bottom shelf so that the children can reach it and get it. If you're way beyond that, please be a little bit patient. I think, though, that you'll find that most of us do better going step by step anyway, in a way that's pretty plain. So one way to think about it is that history is his story. As you go through all the steps down through history, which we'll do, starting from the beginning, you're going to see how very much the concepts in the Bible are foundational to our freedoms. Moses, the first real clear trumpet call of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from oppression. And you can't find anyone like Moses in secular history from that era. He's the first real trumpet call of freedom. So we're going to look at the foundations. What was he standing on to issue this kind of a clear call toward freedom? And it goes just like that, right through the history of Israel, right down to the modern era. So history is indeed his story, meaning God's story. Now we're going to take a slightly different approach. I hope it's kind of entertaining for you. Rather than starting at the beginning, the first thing we're going to do in this introductory series is actually walk back in time, following clues. And there's a series of movies called National Treasure, and they end up, going from clue to clue, which is really entertaining. You learn a lot of things about Benjamin Franklin and different things, and it's always surprising. And so those clues are very good for creating curiosity. And you learn some history along the way as they do it. Well, they're going back to some imaginary thing where they find a warehouse full of gold and stuff from the Knights Templar, something totally imaginary. We're going to look at our actual national treasure as a nation, meaning the United States of America. Now, other countries, other people from other countries have, for the most part, adopted the concepts enshrined in the United States Constitution. So this is something we can all enjoy. And since we're going deeper than just the United States Constitution, we're going to the very essence of what makes people free. Anybody from any country should be able to enjoy this as well. So, what is our true national treasure? Well, the Pilgrims knew. They lost half of their people in the first winter. They were determined, they made huge sacrifices. There was something that they wanted to obtain. In essence, they were like the guy that Jesus talked about that found a treasure in a field, and they were willing to forsake everything to obtain that treasure. And they knew they were after something really, really amazing and really, really big. They knew they were making history. They'd gone from England to the Netherlands, and they were losing their legacy because their kids were just blending in with the Dutch culture, which wasn't really that bad, but they knew that they had a different calling. And so they headed out late in the year, and it got delayed, and well, by the time they got there, winter was coming on. They would never have survived if what we see in Psalm 107 had not taken place for them. Now, this psalm is uncanny because the Jews were not a seafaring people. They left that to the Phoenicians. They usually needed a lot of help when they were going to go to sea, and they didn't really like going to sea at all. So Psalm 107 is a series of vignettes of people that were desperate, who were seeking, who were in trouble, who had a quest, a dream, a vision. Psalm 107 is full of a series of vignettes. One of them is this one here, beginning in verse 23. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. Well, you'll discover that the Pilgrims weren't only just the Pilgrims. They called themselves the Saints. Well, there was a lot of other unsaints, from their viewpoint, in the boat with them. How did they get along? That's what you're going to find out. It wasn't easy. So anyways, they were merchants, and they were working with a merchant company when they went to the New World. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Now, if you remember, on the Mayflower, the main beam snapped. I believe that they used a printing press to put it in place, but they were in deep, deep trouble. And they were indeed going high on the waves and going into the depths. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. And they were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. So the Pilgrims landed instead of in Virginia, they landed in Cape Cod, and they ended up on where the Plymouth Rock is. And in that place, it's kind of a sad story, but the Indians had already been depopulated from the region by sickness, which was tragic, but that's the nature of the lack of immunity that they had. And the Pilgrims were therefore settling in a place that had no occupants. So it was very much of a desired haven, and they were going to be in enough trouble as it was. If they had not had that kind of a refuge, they would really have been in trouble. So it says, let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Well, what happened there? What happened was that they did give thanks, and the Thanksgiving celebration that we have today is based on that. And what happened ultimately was wonderful for all of mankind, because one of the things they had to do when they got there was they had to figure out, how are we going to get along? We've got some really dedicated separatist Christians. They didn't have a state church. They didn't believe in ramming their religion down other people's throats. They believed in freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. So they sure weren't going to say, well, let's force these unbelievers to behave our church code. No, what they did was they established a civil body politic, they called it. In other words, a secular government. Now, we're going to learn not to be scared of that word secular. It doesn't mean that the people that are doing the governing are godless or pagan. Every human is expected to give glory to God, and if they don't bend the knee to God at one point in their time, they will be forced to their knee when Jesus returns. So either you bend your knee to the Lord now, or you'll bend it later, your choice. But our job is not to force you to that conclusion. And when they had their civil body politic, what they did was they established a governing body that was not overtly of the religion or sect of the Pilgrims. It was a tolerant society. And that's one of the great foundations for the American Constitution and ultimately the Bill of Rights, which established the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, so all of these freedoms that were established, that's the foundation of it. And later on, a guy by the name of Roger Williams established the first tolerant colony following in that same thought. And he invited atheists, Jews, Native American Indians. He was an evangelist. He was a very devout Christian, but he did not believe in forcing his faith on others. He believed that people should believe in God because they love God and are persuaded that it's true and that they want to believe in God. So the true founding fathers, people are always talking about how bad George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Well, if that's their feeling, they ought to go back and look at these great men of God who established our freedom and our tolerance. And the very same people made agreements with Thomas Jefferson, who was really sort of a secularist at the time. And the two of them together got together and they did a lot of work to give us our Bill of Rights. And they did a lot of work to establish freedom of religion. So all of the things that we have in our country come right out of the concepts we see in Psalm 107. Our national treasure is exactly this, that the love of God and the truth about Jesus Christ, his death, life, death, and resurrection are so persuasive that we don't need to force them on anybody, and that love is what should motivate us. That is our true national treasure. And as the world adopts that and doesn't use force to cause people to either not be religious or to believe in a certain brand of religion, that kind of joy and blessedness that we have in our tolerant and free society will be theirs as well. Well, we have seen a big picture of what our national treasure is, but the real question is, where did it come from? Because that's the real nature of finding this treasure, is tracing it back and finding where it came from. And the first clue we have is to search for a revolution of some kind, okay? And we have here in this picture a very familiar picture from the American Revolution. And there's a lot that we could see there, but these guys aren't the ones we're looking for. The Glorious Revolution came almost 100 years before the American Revolution. But let's talk for just a minute about the American Revolution. They called it, at the time, many people called it the Scottish Revolution, because the Scots had developed a set of principles which they were unable to implement in their country because England didn't tolerate it. And the same ideas broke out in this country, particularly around Boston, Massachusetts. So the American Revolution, even this one, really had its origins in Scotland and in England. And there was a whole process whereby that came to happen. A lot of people think, well, it all began with the Magna Carta. Well, as you're going to find out, the Magna Carta didn't have a whole lot to do with it. It helped, but the real origins of the freedoms that we have came from what we call the Glorious Revolution. And this ain't it. So let's find out what the Glorious Revolution really was. The Glorious Revolution didn't happen in 1776. It happened in 1688. And what happened was England had a normal king. It was somewhat of a more light-handed monarchy because of the deeper Anglo-Saxon traditions, which came from the tribal values of the Anglo-Saxons, which were then reinforced by the Magna Carta and some other things. But for the most part, England still had a normal monarchy, but they were conquered by the Dutch. William III came and conquered England, and the English that I know won't even admit it. And they were really kind of good at what they did. They won a propaganda war. There was a king in England who seemed to be moving in the direction of bringing back the Roman Catholic Church, and that they were going to reestablish the Inquisition and become very, very intolerant and brutal on the English people, enforcing the Roman Catholic faith. And there was just this fear that that was creeping in and it would keep gaining ground and that he would finally do that. So they won a propaganda war. The printing press was kind of new. They printed a bunch of leaflets, and the so-called Whig Party was rising up against that possibility of Roman Catholic tyranny. The Tories, on the other hand, were the ones that were more for the monarchy. Well, does that all sound familiar? Do you remember that if you know American history, the pro-British government was called the Tories, and the independence-minded group was called the Whigs. So you can see how very much what happened in the American colonies was growing out of what happened in England. And so William III was able to come in, and one of the reasons it's called a glorious revolution is that it was fairly bloodless. So in that sense, even though it was an invasion of the Dutch, and even though the Dutch did conquer England, they couldn't have done it the way they did it if they hadn't have already won a propaganda war to where better than half the English were just ready for this. And the Tories had no courage. They lost they didn't want to have another English Civil War. They'd had a terrible, bloody Civil War in 1655, some years before 1688. They'd had a terrible, bloody Civil War that was something we could discuss at some point too. But the whole thing of it is they didn't want to have another one of those. So the Glorious Revolution, in contrast to the English Civil War, which happened before, was pretty much bloodless, and it was done pretty much via persuasion. So I do think too that the British don't like to admit that they got most everything that was worth anything from the Dutch, including their art and many other things. But the idea of a republic, what they call a constitutional monarchy, where the king more and more became a figurehead, the head of state, but the prime minister of parliament, which is like our Congress, became the real head of government. So they had then a democracy of sorts, but we call it a republic because it's representative government. The big point is it was no longer just ruled by a king. This is the beginning of democracy in England, and it was sort of rammed down their throat, whether the English will admit it or not, by the Dutch. Well, what if the clue that you'd been given was that a vast armada was poised to invade England? And you're thinking, oh, I know what that is. That's the Spanish Armada. They were coming and they were going to force the Roman Catholic faith on the English people. And this huge, huge fleet from a very, very powerful country of Spain was going to invade England. And they had what they called a Protestant wind. It was a fierce wind. And it first helped them win a sea battle. But then when the Spanish tried to get away, they were really destroyed in terrible storms as they tried to go around England through the North Sea. So that's what this picture is that Spanish Armada being destroyed by what they called a Protestant wind, because basically it really crushed the dreams the Roman Catholics had of imposing their Inquisition and their faith by force on the English people. But that's not the Armada that we're talking about. This wasn't the Spanish Armada. It was an armada that was 3 times bigger, and it succeeded in conquering England. Well, we'd already talked about that because, of course, it was the fleet of William III and the Dutch who were able to conquer England. Now, I mentioned they called it a Protestant wind, which destroyed the Spanish fleet. Well, in this case, the Protestant wind did something quite interesting. It kept the Roman Catholic oriented king's fleet in port. They couldn't get out because the wind was against them. And it was a very surprising wind. It wasn't normal for this to happen, but it allowed the Dutch to easily land on the coast of England. So at that point, the enemies of the Dutch and the Whig Party, which I told you was very strong in England already because of the ideas in the propaganda war, which the Dutch had already won, once they were able to land with this magnificently huge fleet, the Tories lost heart completely. So that's the Armada that we're talking about. It did conquer England. And again, it was one of the beautiful things that happened in history, in his story, to end the tyranny of the Roman Catholic Inquisition. Well, by now you might be getting kind of curious about these Dutch. This shows this huge fleet, this huge armada being assembled in the Netherlands and getting ready to conquer England. So here they are. They're getting everything on their fleet, and they're getting ready to cross the English Channel and conquer England in what again we called the Glorious Revolution. But what's with these Dutch? Well, it's an amazing story. You couldn't make it up. As a matter of fact, when you tell people, it's like, I can't believe this. That's unbelievable. But there was this mighty French king called the Sun King. He ruled like forever, and his monarchy was headed in the opposite direction of the English monarchy. His monarchy was headed to a more absolute monarchy, where the technology and the modern advances they had were causing the kings to gain greater power over their country. There's a lot that went into that, but that was a trend because of technology at the time. And so the Sun King, uh, Louis XIV, he was invading the Netherlands, this tiny little country, and he was being very, very successful. There's a lot that goes into it. It's an amazing story, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that. But finally, they were losing so badly, they put William III into a leadership role, very much like our president of the United States. They realized that to have effective military leadership, you had to give a certain degree of power to one individual. And that's why our presidency is as strong as it is, partly from looking at what happened in the Netherlands, because they were getting beat and they were getting beaten badly. So William III, first thing he did was he said to let the flood to release the dams so that the Dutch area that was lower than sea level was flooded. Some of you may know that the Netherlands was reclaimed from the sea. They would build these dams and then they would use windmills and they would pump the water out of the area there, and then that would be reclaimed farmland. And that's how the Netherlands got a lot of its land. So to protect themselves, they went ahead and flooded that, and the armed soldiers would have, sunk and drowned in their armor, so they could not invade. Then William III and the Dutch invaded England, conquered England. Then they used the English military might to uh, invade Ireland, and where the Catholics were strong, and to resist the ability of the French to come up through the Roman Catholic country of Ireland, and therefore to conquer England in that way. So what happened was that William III was losing badly, desperate, invaded England, and then used the English military might to prevent the Roman Catholic governments, which the French were Roman Catholic, just like the Spanish had been Roman Catholic. So they were able, by doing that, to preserve the freedom of both of those countries, and they both became very powerful as merchant nations and as countries that would spread uh, their colonies throughout the world. So really, what happened was that William III was able to do that. However, you're noticing that he had a republican government. He did not have an absolute monarchy. Even though they gave him a lot of power, he it was really hard for the Dutch to give him that much power because they had a long tradition of being a republican government and not having a monarchy or a king. They just called him the stadtholder, which meant the leader of the state. So that's what William III was. He was the stadtholder. We basically call him the president. Okay, so that's what was going on. We have to look into this though and dig deeper to see really how this Dutch Republic got started. Where did their democracy, so to speak, where did that come from? Well, if you thought the story of William III and how he was able to escape the power of this mighty so-called Sun King, the King of France, if you think that was amazing, wait till you hear this one. William I was the first leader of the Dutch, and he was the leader of the Dutch Revolt. Well, who were they revolting from? Well, let me paint the picture. The the monarchy of the King Philip II of Spain was the first empire on which the sun never set. Think about what had happened. Uh, Columbus had discovered America, and the Spanish were colonizing the Americas. They were building universities of medicine and law up in Bolivia. They were establishing the same kinds of things in Mexico City. They had a mighty empire in the Americas. They had their own country in Spain, and they were allied with the Habsburgs of Austria. Now, what was the Austrian empire like? They called it the Holy Roman Empire. There was a loosely associated group of German kingdoms. Germany was not a united country at the time, which is why Martin Luther was able to do well. But anyway, the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, for the most part, was Austria, and it extended down into Italy even, and included part of Rome. So that's why they called it the Holy Roman Empire. So obviously, that by itself was a very, very powerful empire. And then when it was united with the new empire of Spain, they were united together. They were ruling the Philippines in the Pacific Ocean and much of that territory. They were ruling the Americas. So it was the empire on which the sun never set, and it was formidably powerful. Now, the Spanish warriors were the best warriors in the world. They had fought for 700 years to throw the Islamic forces out of Spain, called the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain. So after 700 years of military tradition and training, the Spanish warriors were the terror of the world. They were very, very, very powerful warriors. And the Dutch decided they would revolt. And it was not pretty. The Dutch lost every single battle except one, and that was near the beginning. So they lost all their battles as the thing went on. Okay. And yet they still won because it just was amazing that their determination was so strong. And you kind of want to wonder what was driving these guys on, what was making them think the way they did. Well, the Dutch revolt was in three phases, and I won't go into all that, but each phase had a very strong religious element. The first one is the one I want to talk about. The Dutch just got tired of watching the Spanish Inquisition burn people at the stake. There's a lot of reasons why they were kind of predisposed to a more of a freedom loving way of thinking. But they began to manifest this desire to not have these bloody inquisitions. And the people they were killing were people who their basic belief was that they wanted to follow what Jesus taught. They believed in loving their enemies. You couldn't get them to join the army for the most part. They were peaceful, loving disciples of Jesus Christ was their main characteristics. And the leaders of the Netherlands were not those kind of people, but they were favorable toward them enough that they got tired of watching the Roman Catholics kill them. And because they were starting to be not really Roman Catholic themselves, they knew that they could be killed just like these other people were being killed. In fact, the Roman Catholics made a terrible mistake. They killed two of the Dutch leaders, and that made everybody realize that there was no way that they were going to be able to live with this in the long run. So they revolted. They finally succeeded. Basically, the Spanish ran out of money, and they became a very, very powerful nation. Now, why don't we hear much about that? Well, England fought a couple of unjust wars against the Dutch, and a couple they got beat sometimes pretty bad. So the Dutch and the English were big time competitors. Like I said, the English never really want to admit that they inherited almost everything that's worth anything from the Dutch. Their art, their culture, their military tactics, they got it from the Dutch, and they got a lot of their religion from the Dutch. It's called Calvinism, and the Puritans in England were Calvinists, but this was really, really strong in the Netherlands. So There wasn't a lot of desire for the English to do that. Now, so that's why this treasure hunt is really interesting. The Americans aren't that excited to talk about the Glorious Revolution in England because we talk about 1776 and the American Revolution. And we were fighting the Parliament in England. We weren't fighting a monarchy. We were fighting a parliament, a constitutional monarchy where the Parliament had power in England, and the Prime Minister had a lot of the say in what would happen. So really, it was two democracies fighting. So America wasn't the first democracy, is the point. And I don't think we're that eager to admit that. Okay, there was a lot of things in the way we established religious freedom, however, which was a little bit unique. So you don't want to give up on seeing that part of the American Revolution. And so anyway, the Americans don't want to admit what they got from the English. The English don't want to admit what they got from the Dutch, and the Dutch don't want to admit what they got from those wonderful Christians that were being killed there. They are called the Radical Reformation, and they were the ones. Now you're getting to the real treasure. They were the ones that read the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the apostles, and they said that we should not force our religion on other people. And they were the ones that stood their ground. They were tortured, they were killed, and yet they would not turn from that conviction to love their enemies, to pray for those who were persecuting them. And they thought things through, and it was difficult. But they came to the point where they realized that they needed to choose to be believers. So they said, when you become a believer, you need to be baptized. Well, that was a real huge problem back then because your baptism is when you got your quote social security number, if I might put it that way. That's if you didn't get baptized as an infant, you were off the grid. So it was like a major revolutionary concept that the world wasn't really ready for these people because they didn't baptize their infants. They People were baptized when they were old enough to choose to be a believer. And this is what's called the Radical Reformation. Now, they've been demonized, and when I was young, back in the 1970s, it was just beginning to be where we even were uncovering their history because the Catholics and the Lutherans and the Calvinists, the victors, because they had persecuted and killed these Christians, had written the history. When the winners write the history, you don't necessarily get the history. So we're going to dig just a little bit deeper here and find out more about these people. Who are the great thinkers of history? Have you even heard of them? Let's look and find out. Well, first let me tell you who it wasn't. It wasn't the so-called French Enlightenment. Okay, they were against capital punishment. They were very, very enlightened. They wrote what they called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and they felt really self-important. They stole all their concepts from these wonderful radical Reformation Christians, and then they decided that it was better to kill everybody. So what they did was they invented, as far as we can tell, the nearly painless amputation of the head. So they made these guillotines with a big, huge blade that would come down and chop everyone's head off. And they decided that capital punishment was a good idea, and they killed zillions of people just because they were paranoid. So that wasn't where it came from. Now, if you talk to a lot of unbelievers, they'll boast about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and go on and on about these French thinkers, Rousseau, Voltaire, on and on and on. They got a lot of their ideas from watching the Christians get burned at the stake. Voltaire got sick of it. He got sick of watching these people killed. And he decided the Catholic Church was more or less like the world being shaved by a drunken barber. He just really didn't think the Roman Catholics had, and he was right, of course, that kind of uh, torturing and killing people who weren't Roman Catholic. And I'm not anti-Roman Catholic. There's a lot of things I could say about that, but I'm just pointing out that they were in that day very, very brutal, and the Inquisition was a horrible, horrible thing. But we got to point out too that the Lutherans also believed it was a capital offense to be rebaptized. So these believers that were baptizing people when they got born again when they were saved and when they became a believer, when they stopped being drunkards and fornicators, whatever they were, and began to really follow the Lord, that's when they were baptized. Well, everybody was killing them. Even John Calvin was killing them. And so the first of the Calvin, the Reformed Church was begun by Zwingli. Calvin picked up because Zwingli got killed in a war. So Calvin picked up where Zwingli left off, but Zwingli really started the Reformed Church, and he tortured and killed his own students, who became then the bold founders of the radical Reformation, so called. These are the ones that are following Jesus. They're the ones that wanted to obey him and love their enemies. And there was a man named Balthasar Hubmaier who was a pretty clear thinker among them. And he was going a step in the direction they didn't really like, but I'm sure that he was correct. He said that the government was duly authorized to punish evildoers, and therefore that when a government official does what needs to be done to punish an evildoer, that was what God had ordained the government to do. Now the other ones were like, I don't want to cut anybody's head off. I don't care if they're a murderer, So and they wanted to love everybody, but and that was good. But Balthasar Hubmaier realized that the government had been established by God, and therefore, when somebody is a government official, that they're operating within God's sanction. So he developed the thoughts quite a bit further, and he realized that yes, it's against Jesus's teachings to force your religion down other people's throats and to torture and kill, burn, drown anybody that disagrees with you. But he did not set aside legitimate human government. So Balthasar Hubmaier is a very seminal voice in history, and nobody even knows who he is. Well, they burnt him at the stake eventually, obviously. These guys had very short life expectancies if they didn't believe in ramming their religion down everybody else's throat. Now, there's something really interesting. They wrote the concept of the separation of church and state. Now, a lot of Christians hate that now. For some, they don't really get it necessarily. But we came up with the concept of the separation of church and state. And it's because they were torturing us and killing us, okay? So it wasn't for us the idea that you have a secular government in it. Like I said, the people who are running the government are godless people that don't believe in God at all, and they're just totally secularized. But that government is not there to establish a denomination of the Christian faith or to ram its beliefs down anyone's throat. The Jews could be there. In America, Native Americans joined it. You could be an atheist. And that all happened in the Netherlands. You started to get a lot of the Jews fled Spain and they went to the Netherlands after the Netherlands was free. And then they went to England, and the British under Cromwell uh, accepted the Jews. And then in America, Roger Williams, he also accepted the Jews. So the Jewish people were always welcomed by these Christians that were influenced by the beliefs in tolerance and freedom. So although it wasn't very strong, totally strong, it was so far ahead of everywhere else that people would flee to the Netherlands for freedom. And so this man, Balthasar Hubmaier, is a name to remember. There's other very key players that we could talk about. Michael Sattler, we could talk about all the early leaders of the movement. But what I want you to realize is it all really began, strangely enough, let me tell you how it happened, with the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 1400s. Did you know that the Roman Empire continued into the 1400s? But when the Turks got a hold of cannons, they destroyed the wall of Constantinople, and all the Greek Christians with their Greek Bibles fled to Spain and to the West, not Spain, but to Italy and the West, and they brought their Greek Bibles, and it caused a tremendous curiosity about the New Testament. And everybody wanted to get away from just the Latin Bible, which was big in the Catholic Church, and get to the roots of the Christian faith. There was a whole movement, and it's part of the Renaissance, actually. So there was this whole desire to get back to things that were lost during the Dark Ages. And so the Bible, the New Testament, was the great inspiration for a lot of what we treasure today. But chief among them is what I call our national treasure again, that we should love our enemies, that we should be tolerant, that our society should be based on a government which does punish evildoers, murderers, and such, but doesn't force your beliefs on others. There's a lot more that we're going to get into with that. And the next time we discuss these matters, we're going to start at the beginning and work our way from then. And especially Moses, that great voice for freedom. But we're going to bring you right down through history, and coming from that direction, get to the modern era. So that will be the history of freedom and tolerance, and it is his story. History is his, which is God's story. Well, one of my favorite teachers, one of my favorite mentors is Bruce Gore. And whenever he does a discussion on history, he makes it part of a Bible lesson that he's doing at church. So he teaches history in the church. So he always ends up with something beautifully scriptural to wrap up the thinking. Now, these guys didn't just write the concepts of the separation of church and state and the belief in freedom and tolerance. They also wrote our hymns. And strangely enough, the ones that were killing them did like their hymns. And so they picked them up, and we've been singing them all these years, even as, like I said, up until my era in the 1970s, their history wasn't even well known because they had lost the battles in terms of who was getting killed. And since the winners write the history, their history was concealed. That's why you don't know about Balthasar von Meyer. That's why you don't know about Michael Sattler. Okay, but these hymns are their legacy, and it just explains. If you go through this hymn, you might as well be going through the United States Constitution. Faith of our fathers. Let's look at the lyrics. Faith of our fathers, living still in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whene'er we hear God's glorious word. As you hear God's glorious word, it's the inspiration for freedom. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. Well, the unbelievers are always talking about Galileo. Okay, the Catholic Church wanted to tell him that the sun went around the earth, and Galileo said, no, the earth goes around the sun. And so they leaned on him. They didn't kill him or anything, but so they talk about how the Catholic Church, they try to say Christianity was suppressing knowledge. Well, I'm going to tell you, for the most part, like Voltaire, he asked for last rites from the Catholic Church. He was very much against the Catholic Church, but he gave in to the Catholic Church. And this is common with the secular minds. They would try to speak up, and then the Pope and the Inquisition would come along, and they'd say, oh, time for us to torture you. And they would say, no, you're right, we'll go along with you. And they would give in. But these Christians, look what they're singing here. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. They were tortured. As they were being tortured, they would say, you're doing this to us, but I want to tell you, we still love you. God loves you. God came in his son and he died for you. See, Jesus was the first tolerant guy, right? So they were following their leader. They were following Jesus Christ. And they were true as steel. Of course, some would waver when they were tortured and so forth. But for the most part, they were slaughtered across Europe. They didn't have very many places to hide. And they finally took refuge in the Netherlands. That was one of the few places that they could actually get away with existing without being slaughtered and killed. And they were exterminating them from Europe until they got into the United States. And then the cat was out of the bag, and it spread to the whole world after that. But let's read the next verse. Our fathers chained in prisons dark were still in heart and conscience free. Well, freedom of conscience is what these people were fighting for. And blessed would be their children's fate if they, like them, should die for thee. Well, when you're not afraid of death, what are you afraid of? And that's kind of what we're saying here, isn't it? That these guys had something going for them that the secular people that tried to oppose the Roman Catholic Church didn't have. Next verse. Faith of our fathers, God's great power, not the sword, right? Not torturing people, not forcing on people, the power of love, right? Let's read that verse. Faith of our fathers, God's great power, shall draw all nations unto thee. And through the truth that comes from God, his people shall indeed be free. I would like to just take you to some videos where Billy Graham is preaching to 1 million people in Korea. And now the Koreans are very strong Christians. If you flying into Seoul, Korea, you'll see crosses on the top all over the place. There's a very strong Christian church in Korea. In Mongolia, everyone wants to be Christian. If you can see a video of Nigeria, 3 million people in one crowd, or 1 million people here, 1 million people there. There's just the Christian faith is now everywhere in the world. How did it conquer the hearts of people? By conquering the hearts of people with love. Last verse. Faith of our fathers, we will love both friend and foe in all our strife, and preach thee too, as love knows how, by witness true and virtuous life. So, so we are now Christians. Sometimes today are not well known. Like I'm not sure that Nancy Pelosi, for instance, really thinks that Christians love her like crazy, or Hillary Clinton, or Chuck Schumer. They might be thinking, "Oh my gosh, these Christians probably before they go to bed say, may God, help him by taking him from the earth or something." You know, they need to feel our love. They need to know our love. We need to be known as those who love others. That is the most powerful force in the world. So that's why I wrapped up with this. It's not just to wrap up this history lesson with a spiritual lesson, but to see how incredibly powerful, how this thing works in practice. How is it that this kingdom of God, a kingdom of love, what the Bible calls an unshakable kingdom, is advancing throughout the world, bringing freedom to people all over the world. Even the Constitution of Communist China pretends to guarantee freedom of religion. Even in India, where sometimes the paramilitary thugs will kill thousands of people, they have a constitution which guarantees freedom of religion. They're trying to have what we have given them. This is the great tradition of freedom and tolerance that we're trying to give them. You say, well, those countries were treated very badly by England and so forth. There's been a lot of paganism mixed in with the Christian faith. And don't ever call the ones who killed us true Christians. The ones who were killing the true Christians were not the true Christians. And it's doubly insulting because, first off, they were killing us. And second off, you're blaming Jesus for people that didn't follow Jesus. So let's lift up the teachings of Jesus. He is the one who defines what a Christian is. And a Christian, by definition, loves his enemies. That is the definition of what it means to be a Christian. The New Testament gives the definition of Christianity, not the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or the Lutheran Church. None of those churches gives the definition of Christianity. The definition of Christianity is contained in the New Testament. So that's that. That's the introduction. I hope you've enjoyed it. And we're going to move on to a discussion starting at the beginning. Start with the foundations of the belief in freedom and tolerance.